took me like 40s to realize this. Pain is part of the human condition. We're going to have moments that don't feel good, but when we are able to radically accept it and love ourselves in that, we do move through it. Suffering is optional. Suffering is when we resist it. When we try to deny it, we intellectualize, we minimize, we use toxic positivity, we put icing on a mud pie to try to make it taste good.
Unlost Cause is a community that shares stories of individuals 40 and beyond who found the courage to reclaim their dreams and live without regrets. I'm David New, and I hope these stories help you find joy, purpose, and passion in a life true to you. Today's guest is Allison Briggs, a licensed therapist, writer, and mother of two who didn't just rebuild her life after 40, she reclaimed it. After navigating a traumatic childhood, a painful divorce, and the realities of raising a neurodivergent child, Allison turned her deepest wounds into powerful work. She's the founder of Being Real, PLLC, a trauma-informed practice helping women break free from codependency and reclaim their voice. Her story is raw, honest, and a reminder that starting over doesn't mean you're lost. It means you're finally coming home. Allison, welcome to Unlost Cause.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Great. Well, to start, could you please share with the audience what Being Real does in a couple sentences so our listeners can understand your company at a high level before we dive into the journey that precedes that?
Sure. I am, my background, I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I've been licensed since 2017. When I first went into private practice around 2018, I wasn't sure what niche I was going to take. I thought it would be with kids because that's where I came from, working with kids. But it was kind of an unexpected turn. And I ended up specializing with people who had developmental trauma and struggled with codependency, mostly women.
Got it. And so, one of the things with Unlost Cause is we know that a story and a journey starts with many steps, and then some of the most formative steps start from childhood. So let's rewind the clock there, Allison, and start with childhood. And maybe with some broad brushes, share with the listeners what your childhood was like.
Well, it's very long, but I think that the big parts, there was a lot of developmental trauma. I am a Gen X kid, and, all the memes that you see about like Gen X kids taking care of themselves and, divorced parents, all of that was kind of me. But then, the other component was there was abuse involved, and there were drugs and mental health issues. And my mom and dad, they separated when I was very young, too young to really remember. And they started having fights about, who I was going to be with between 3 and 4 years old. And then at that time, they started to there were a lot of power struggles and kidnapping me back and forth it lasted for, I don't know exactly because I was a kid at that time, but I would venture to say probably, a year or so. And eventually I ended up staying with my dad for 2 years. My mom was too afraid to come get me because she was afraid he was going to do something to her. And she didn't think that the courts were going to help her. She already had mental health struggles. And when I was living with him and my stepmom, she was very, very abusive. And my dad, he was a cable guy at the time, and he hooked up free cable for us. And I remember sitting in front of this, TV, those 80s TVs that sit on the ground, the real big, and just sitting like really close up to the TV watching Mommy Dearest. And it imitated so much of what I felt like I was going through at the time. And then her sharing her story at the end. And I remember thinking to myself at some point, during that time frame, I think it was when my stepmom had hurt me again. I was in my closet, and I remember thinking, I'm going to tell my story one day, because I knew that if I spoke up at all in the house at that time, I would get in trouble. And there were I had 2 stepsisters, and, it was a blended family situation. And again, there were drugs involved and stuff. And so there was a lot of lying and stuff like that with my stepsisters. And because of that, I ended up just being quiet a lot and just holding things in a lot because I was too afraid. And I also knew that, and this other part kind of intuitively unfolded over the course of the next 18 years of my life. I knew that I wanted to either help kids or help adults who had been through what I had been through. So I didn't know exactly what it was going to look like. But, when my mom finally did come to get me, and she didn't kidnap me, she finally made peace with him and tried to kind of do things his way. We went into, at some point, I want to say it was around 9 years old, we went into hiding because he was very abusive, violent, scary, and went to 15 different schools. We were homeless sometimes, lived with strangers that my mom, befriended through, because she had her own mental health struggles, and she was at one point she was going to AA. And so she would meet different people through some of the AA groups, and we would like live at people's, houses for a couple of months. And so at that point, it was kind of just survival mode. And so that dream went to the back burner. And by the time I was 18, I just wanted to graduate from college. I wanted to be the first person in my family to graduate from college and have a secure job, because there was so much financial insecurity when I was growing up. So the dream, it never went away, but it was very far away at that point. But I always knew that I would circle back to it. I just didn't know when.
Yeah. Well, Allison, thank you for the raw honesty and the vulnerability there. So one of the themes that you talk about is around codependency and this perfectionist, right? And as you think back upon your childhood, did you see those patterns developing with the adults or family members around you, or developing in yourself as a coping or some type of mechanism, given the situation that you were in?
I think that codependency, it definitely goes hand in hand with developmental trauma. I think that people who have developmental trauma, which is just childhood trauma, and developmental trauma it can range from like emotional neglect all the way up to, severe physical and sexual abuse. But like developmental trauma is something that ends up pervading every area of someone's life. It's not like you have visual flashbacks. You can, but the flashbacks that are happening when you grow up, they're more in your body and in your nervous system. And so a lot of times people who grow up in developmental trauma, they either develop addictions, some type of addiction. They may have like autoimmune issues. They may end up struggling with codependency. They're all nervous system issues. So when you get wired to be hypervigilant, right, because you don't know what's going to happen next, you become really attuned to the environment, body language cues, all of that stuff. And for someone who's codependent specifically, codependency is at its most elementary form, it's kind of what you learn is I have to regulate your nervous system so that I can feel regulated. I have to make sure you're okay so I can be okay. And so a lot of times people who have those codependent tendencies and had developmental trauma, they may have had a parent who struggled with mental health issues. It could be addiction issues. It could be abuse, but they learned to adapt to the environment and, people please, go into fawning and being compliant, or just kind of going along to get along to keep the peace and staying below the radar. And when you've done that for 18 years, or you've done it consistently over a period of time, it becomes your identity. And that feels like that's normal. You don't know anything else. So when you're, and I think we all do this, we have these unconscious patterns. Everyone does, that comes from childhood. But we don't question those patterns a lot. We don't pause and go, well, why did I just do that? And we can continue to repeat these cycles for quite a while until we start to see, oh, this is a thing. Like it's been happening for a while. Obviously, something's going on. And sometimes people don't figure that out. I feel like I was the lucky one. Some people figure it out when they're 20. Some people figure it out when they're 30. I didn't figure it out until it took me literally around the time I was going into private practice. Ironically, that's when I figured it out. I figured it out when I was going into private practice.
Got it. And then Allison, on the flip side, in terms of like when you were growing up, like role models who may, a lot of the guests who come on the show on Lost Cause, they have like a role model who models some entrepreneurship. It could be a family friend, a pastor, a relative. And then they're like, oh, I kind of want to do that, but then it gets buried. Did you have any of those role models, or it could be like from books or TV or that you looked up to or thought about?
I've had people ask me those kind of questions, like so much through adulthood, I remember when I was in college, I was going to a college counselor for a little while, and she said, "Do you have a role model? Have you ever?" And I stopped and thought, and I was like, "No, I don't." I think that the closest thing to it would probably be books and movies. And so that was my way of escaping into fantasy and seeing that there was something else that was possible, even if it was a true story. So there were certain movies like Mommy Dearest that I saw, and I was like, she got out of it and she told her story. Another one that I really liked was the movie Rudy. I remember seeing that it was my first year in college. And that was so encouraging to see, this little runt kid and everyone saying, "You can't do it. You can't do it." He was like, and he didn't think he could for a little while. And eventually something, his friend dying catalyzed him to do it. So I did hold on to that movie for a little while. So it was more of people I didn't know. I would hear stories like that, and I think my thought was, well, if they did it, maybe I can do it. But it still felt very far away. And so for me, it was baby steps. It was little baby steps the entire way through. It wasn't a big leap.
Got it. And you just said earlier that your goal was to be the first one in your family to graduate from college, which you did. So can you share, what did you study in college and why did you choose that major? Since it was a bit uncharted, right? Because you were the first one to go through that process.
Well, because we moved so much, I went to 15 different schools. Every time I would start to get excited or work hard towards something, it would be taken away because we would move. And so by the time I was in high school, I just was like, I'm just going to coast. I kind of said, I'm going to, just get by. I just want to graduate from high school. I knew that I didn't really have any financial support. But I knew I could, I was dating someone at the time who was in he was in community college. I was in high school at the time. We went to the same high school. And I would say he was a little bit of an influence at that time. But, so I guess there was a little bit of that too, seeing him. And it was, and so I was like, well, I could just go to a community college, and I can get a Pell Grant. And so I ended up getting a Pell Grant and going to community college and living with a friend's family because at that point, my mom had moved to Florida. And I remember the first semester looking at an occupational outlook handbook, you could check one out from the library, and I was looking through it. And in my head, if I'm being really honest with you, I wanted to just get the job where I could never get fired. It sounds really bad. It sounds bad, but that's how low the bar was for me, because my mom could never hold down a job because she had major mental health issues. And so we were constantly in survival mode. And I was like, well, what job? I was afraid of getting fired because she always got fired or she got laid off. And, and it's sad to say this. And I still loved kids. I wanted to work with kids. I wanted to be like a psychologist but that felt very far away. And so I was like, I could do 4 years. And the other thought was, well, if I ever have kids, I'll have the summers off. I do love kids. I want to work with kids. And so teaching, honestly, it seemed like the practical thing to do. It seemed very stable, very secure. Again, doesn't sound great, but that was my thought process at the time.
So you study psychology as undergrad?
Well, I got my bachelor's of science in interdisciplinary studies, and I was certified with elementary school kids, English and early childhood up to, I think, 8th grade. And I ended up graduating in 98. And then shortly after that, I knew that I needed to start applying for teaching positions. But actually, in February, about a few months before I graduated from college, I started thinking, you know what, I think I want to travel. Like, I want to see the world. And a lot of times teachers, they can join certain programs. At the time, there was something called JET, Japanese Exchange Teaching Program. And I had looked into that. And I ended up at the multicultural counseling, or the multicultural department. I was going to University of Houston, Clear Lake. And I was talking to them about what kind of places could I apply for if I'm going to be a teacher. And this girl who was working there said, well, have you thought about the Peace Corps? And I had never thought about the Peace Corps. And I said, well, what's that like? What? And she said, well, you would stay for 2 years. And I'm like, I don't know if I want to stay. She goes, but it's not something that's like a contract. You're not like breaking so I said, so if I'm there for a few months and I decide I don't want to, I can come back. And she said, yeah, you can come back if for some reason it's not something that you feel comfortable with. And she had been in the Peace Corps, and I think she was in Mauritania or something. And she said, well, and I asked her, I said, did you become fluent? Like, did you learn the language when you went? And she said, yes. I said, really? I said, so if I went, I would learn I said, I took Spanish in high school and I can barely say 2 sentences. She goes, no, you'll learn because you get completely immersed. And so that sounded really interesting to me. So I applied into the Peace Corps, but it's a very long process. So by the time I graduated from, that year, I was still kind of waiting around. I had been through a few different kind of phases of the interview process, but hadn't heard anything. So I think it was July, I was like, I need to get a job. And so I ended up getting a teaching position as a first grade teacher in Pasadena at a school called, I think it was Fisher Elementary. And I started, and then in September, I got an invitation to go into the Peace Corps. And they wanted to send me to a place called Kiribati, which is like 2,000, at the time it was 2,000 people. And I would be living in a thatched hut. And, I think they said, don't answer your door at night to strangers. And I was like, I don't know if that's really safe. So I asked them, I said, if I turn this down, will I have another opportunity? Because I just started teaching. I have a contract. And they said, yeah, you'll have other opportunities, but eventually we'll stop sending invitations. And I got another one in October, and that one in October was to Thailand. And I would be leaving January of 99. So it would be mid-semester. So I talked to the principal at the school, and I said, I don't want to leave you hanging. Like, this is the situation. Like, if, I will stay if you want me to. And she was actually really excited for me. And she said, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. Definitely take it. And they were able to find a teacher to, come the second semester. So, my kids haven't had enough time for, us to kind of have that closure and everything. I know I'm kind of rambling. Sorry.
No, no, that's great. And, when I looked at your background, Allison, the one that stuck out was like the Peace Corps, right? Because I consider that it's super highly selective, and it sounds like you didn't travel that much. And then the first place you go, I mean, the Peace Corps sends you to super remote locations with not a lot of support. And the burnout rate is actually exceptionally high because people get lonely and homesick. And so you decide and you talked about you wanted the safe route, and then you had that job, but then you're going to the Peace Corps, which is only like I think a 2-year commitment. Then you have to come back, which seems like the opposite of that. So what was going on there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was, and that's probably a little bit of a paradox for me, because I do like safety and stability, but I found myself in some very dangerous situations too. So, and I think that honestly is a little something that has to do with developmental trauma. I think a lot of times the brain, our brains are pattern seeking. And so a lot of times, if people who have grown up in developmental trauma, they're used to chaos. They're used to change. So as much as I consciously yearned for stability, there is always a conscious part that's driving me to find something that's different, that's new, that's exciting, and that really what it is, because the brain doesn't really know the difference between, that physiological response that we have when it comes to fear. It's the same physiological response we have for excitement. It's the same response, but the story we tell ourselves around it is different. That was a familiar feeling, that feeling of fear, that feeling of, but, so with that being said, ironically, the Peace Corps offers both. It is both secure, and there is a big piece that's unknown, because there is an entity that's protecting you that's there. It's a big entity that's protecting you, that's looking out for you, that you get, health insurance. They're giving you trainings. You're not just thrown out on your own. It was very scary, though. I mean, after I did it, and even talking, my family was like, I can't believe you're doing this. And, when I ended up, but I would not take any part of it back. It was very hard. It was very hard. The first year was, and then also not really dealing with my own developmental trauma. I think that there were parts of that kind of came up when I was there, but when I went the first year, the part that probably was coming up around my developmental trauma was a lot of loneliness because, when you're remote and you're in a place where no one speaks your language and it's, it takes time for you to learn the language. All you have to do is sit with your own thoughts and feelings.
Yep. There's no internet,
Right.
no mobile phones.
None of that. And so there were lots of moments of that. And there was a lot of reflection, but there wasn't enough insight at the time for me to see the patterns in my mind as patterns in my mind. In other words, it's very different to be thinking things and having feelings versus saying these are thoughts and feelings and have more of a meta perspective and be able to see those thoughts and feelings without getting attached to them. And ironically, being in Thailand was probably a stepping stone for the kind of therapist I became later on.
And then, so when you think about that time, because I had studied abroad in 1994 in Beijing, so that was a few years before then, but I had a cohort of people. I was in this large city, although there's no internet and there's one phone on the floor. And I got the most exciting time of the day was when the mail person came, because I was just excited that perhaps I would get, some type of news or a letter in the mail. So, I learned a lot about myself there. So I'm curious, for you had a 2-year stint, what would you say were the 2 biggest learning or takeaways that Allison uncovered about herself or your motivation or your identity after those amazing 2 years there?
So I would say something that was really profound, because I think that your identity is still forming, as well as like your values, your belief system at that age. And I'm like, one of the things that I think that when you've come from like that kind of financial poverty, I'd already come from that. And I could have seen, if I didn't go into the Peace Corps, I could have seen going down a path where I would have maybe strived more for materialism, because I didn't have it. I didn't have that as a child. And it was already kind of happening when I went into the Peace Corps, because I was the one Peace Corps volunteer who had one big bag of shoes. Like when we could only pack like a couple of different, I want to say 2 or 3 different bags. And so they all made fun of me, the other Peace Corps volunteers, because I had all of these shoes. And by the time after living there for 2 years, and I traveled so much around Thailand, and I realized how peaceful it was to live simply, to have a really like simplicity. I learned to value that so much. And in fact, one time it was fun. I went to India with a Peace Corps volunteer when I was there for a couple, we were in India for a couple weeks. And I remember I was traveling with a big stash of money we would keep in our belts, because it wasn't using credit cards or anything like that. And the whole time I was so afraid of like it being stolen and getting lost. And I would constantly check, is it there? Is it there? And by the time I got back to Thailand, I remember I had fallen asleep on a bus, an overnight bus, and I got off and I realized the money had been taken. And the irony is that I actually felt free, because I didn't have anything to hold on to anymore. I was like, well, don't have to worry about, like I don't have to worry about being attached to this anymore. And at the same time, I was learning about that concept of Buddhism. I wouldn't call myself a Buddhist. But it is ironic. Those things have just almost been woven into what I do now, because codependency is an over-attachment. And I think that mindfulness approach, learning to hold things loosely, the basic tenets, like everything is impermanent, nothing is certain, life is painful, it's part of the human condition. Like those are the things that I learned there. And from my friends. And I remember one friend, a really good friend of mine, because Thailand's called the land of smiles. And a good friend of mine, she was in her 40s at the time, and she was always smiling. She was this tiny Asian woman, always smiling. And we're having this like debate in Thai. This is close to the end of my 2nd year. And she was trying to explain the concept of Buddhism. She goes, the tenet is that, life is painful, but when we acknowledge that pain, we're free from suffering. And that made no sense to me as an American. And I was like, what do you mean life is pain? Like, I don't want to hear that. I've already been through enough pain. And you're telling me this is what I have to look forward to? Thanks a lot. Thanks. That makes me feel good. Like I wasn't ready to hear that message, because that's not what America sells. That's not what America sells. America says, follow the 3 steps, the 7 minutes, the 4 habits, and you're going to get to the mountaintop. And then we see depression and anxiety on the rise here. Like, it's a lie. It's all commercialized. It's not, and it actually perpetuates mental health issues. It hurts people more because they feel like they're doing something wrong because they follow the 3 steps. So why have they not arrived? And so and I remember telling her, like, that's not true, because what about when you eat ice cream, or what about when you have a baby, or those are all things. And she smiled. She's like, yeah, she's like, that happens for like a minute, and then you go back to pain. And there's a word, peptio, and that's what, like, a little bit, and then you go back to pain. And what I kind of started to realize, and it took me like 40s to realize this, because I would go back to Buddhism and read different books around it, is that, pain is part of the human condition. We're going to have moments that don't feel good, but when we are able to radically accept it and love ourselves in that, we do move through it. Suffering is optional. Suffering is when we resist it. When we try to deny it, we intellectualize, we minimize, we use toxic positivity. We put icing on a mud pie to try to make something look pretty.
Yeah.
And when you bite into it, it doesn't taste good.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm curious about is you spent 2 years there and you come back. And I remember before I left for China, they told me, David, your culture shock will be worse coming back, the reverse culture shock, than going there. And it made no sense to me because I didn't know anything because I hadn't been. But when I came back, I felt it. I felt like there was this embarrassment of riches and convenience and like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is how I used to take a bus for like 5 cents. And now I'm in this like nice sports car because my friend happens to pick me up. It just felt weird, off, and just a swirl of emotions. So I'm curious for you, when you came back, what were the top 2 or 3 emotions or reactions that you had, given that the severity of the juxtaposition of the two?
So I kind of hesitate to say this, but this is the truth. Like, I came back, it was, I want to say July of 2001. Yeah. And then a couple months later, 9/11 happened. And, I was living near the Burmese border. I was seeing people, like, hearing stories, seeing these refugees that are, have been tortured. There's been, they're living in countries where there's oppression. There's all these horrible things happening. And you don't see news coverage of any of that. And I think that was a little bit hard for me because I saw what was happening with 9/11. I saw people being really angry and, targeting people who were Muslim. And that was frustrating because it felt like this kind of egocentric, like America is at the center of the entire universe. And, I remember I didn't feel like I could talk about that because I knew if I spoke on that, it would lack empathy, because it did lack it, but it was more about an injustice, like feeling like, why are we like it isn't right that happened here. But what about all these other places? What about all these other things that are happening all over the world? They don't get that kind of news coverage. And so that I felt very alone in that. And I didn't really feel like I could share that. The other kind of random thing was I hadn't really spoken a lot of English for 2 years. And so I remember feeling like probably the first year, I just felt like I was a lot of times at a loss for words. It felt like it took a while for my words to come back. And, I think that my perspective around materialism, it changed significantly, almost to a point where it wasn't really realistic, because I was like, well, when I get home, I'm not even going to have a car. I'm just going to take I'm going to ride a bike to work, and I'm not going to have a TV. And I mean, it was a little bit, far removed because I live in Houston. It's not a biker friendly area here, so that's some of those things I didn't really hold on to, but I'll tell you, I did not get a cell phone until 2000, I don't know, 6.
Yes.
And now I get like the updated iPhone. Like I'm definitely still an American. So
yeah. And before we turn the page on that, so do you still keep up with your Thai, and you go to like a restaurant or event? Do you whip it out and people are like, oh my goodness, and you surprise folks?
I wish that I had, I think what happens because I know some Spanish, because when I came back, I love traveling. And so I've been to probably over 30 countries. I did a lot of traveling when I came back before I had kids. And for a while, I went to Guatemala, Costa Rica, and I would stay with homestay families because I wanted to learn Spanish. And when I did, my Thai and my Spanish, like I'd get so confused. I would be speaking some Thai and some Spanish. And like sometimes now when I go to a Thai restaurant, like Spanish comes out and I'm like, wait, is that a Thai? But everyone tells me that I haven't been back in it's probably over 20 years now. Everyone says if you go back, it's going to come back, really. And for I keep saying, we're going to go back. We're going to go back. We're going to go back. And I want to, I miss it a lot. But every once in a while, my best friend I met when I was in the Peace Corps. So there's been a couple of times when like her son is around, she doesn't want him to know what we're talking about. She'll try to speak Thai with me, but then she can't remember a lot. And sometimes I'm like, wait, what is that word? So it doesn't really work. We try, but it doesn't work.
Got it. All right. So now you're back in Houston, and looking at your background, it looks like you basically get entrenched in the public school system as a counselor for the next decade or two, approximately. Am I getting that correctly? And if so, what led you back to doing that versus you had this wide-eye opportunity to do something different? Was it that what you shared earlier, this dream or this motivation to help kids or adults like yourself?
Well, I think that, kind of circling back to what we were talking about earlier, and you pointed it out, like it was, very insightful that you noticed that there's always been an inner fight between stability and adventure, and so, that has always been an internal struggle. And so, yeah, I wanted to travel around the world and I wanted to make a career out of it. And I also wanted the stability of like a home, a family. And at the time, I was in a relationship before I went overseas. And so when I came back, so that was a big reason why I came back is, it was had already been a long distance one for a couple of years. And so when I came back, I went back to teaching. I was a fourth grade teacher in a Title I school for about 4 years. And then around that time is when I started to write. Also, I was kind of late 20s trying to figure out like, okay, do I want to become do I want to become a counselor? Do I want to write? Like those two things were always kind of pulling on me, and traveling, and I just started volunteering at the crisis hotline in Houston to see if I really wanted to do that as I was teaching. And I was also writing at the same time. So I was kind of testing the waters to figure out, what do I want to do? Where do I want to go? And, I ended up writing hundreds of pages of a book that was kind of fiction, nonfiction at the time around my mom. And I ended up taking a writer's workshop. And so there were some things that were a little bit discouraging at the time because I just wrote and wrote and wrote. And I kind of realized there wasn't a lot of structure at the end. And the other thing was, my partner at the time, he would kind of tease or make fun of me. And it was enough for me to go like, who am I to like write a book? Like that just feels like, what do I really have to say? I haven't taken any classes around this. I haven't, even though in my mind, I wanted to tell the story of what happened to me. In some way, I wanted to tell that story. I always did. And so I ended up just tabling it and decided to go back to grad school. And it was after I had my first child. So I was 30 and he was probably about 6 months old. And I decided to start at University of St. Thomas and get my master's of education in counseling. And I graduated in 2009, but I started in 2008 is when I became a school counselor. And I did that from 2008 up until 2018.
Got it. And when you were, we talk about guests who are heroes and turning their lost causes into unlost causes. And, you have two. One is this book that stems from childhood. And the second one is, the bravery to start your own practice. So then you go into the school system and you become a counselor. Does that experience add a little bit of fuel to the energy to turn those lost causes into unlost causes? Or does it tend to suffocate it? And then it was that kind of Spitfire moment that you wrote about where it's like too much and then boom, it kind of exploded. Share with the audience, like what was that 10 to 15 years where you're a school counselor, and what was the interplay between that experience and these unlost causes that you had?
It was a little bit of both. Like I would say that it created a pathway, but it also created a little bit of like that intellectualizing, that complacency where I was like, oh, I'm good here. Like, it was like when I went to get my master's of education and counseling, you have to take additional classes to get your licensure. And it was going to be 4 more classes and thousands of hours. And I was like, I'm done. I'm good, And I did like working with kids. I knew the school systems. I already knew I'd been a teacher. And so as far as the writing went, I don't think I was really conscious. I wasn't thinking about this book at the time, but I always loved writing. And it just came out in different ways. So ironically, when I think that was so far in the back for me, because when my second son was born, he had like significant medical issues. Like he was in the hospital for the first 6 weeks of his life. He had a 50-50 chance of survival. He was in the NICU and on maximum life support. And he had just a nurse. It was just 1-to-1. He was the one that was like just one nurse monitoring him the entire time. And he ended up having a surgery at 2 weeks old to get a Gore-Tex patch put on his diaphragm because he had a congenital diaphragmatic hernia and the hole was like the size of a biscuit. And they come to find out, they did genetic testing and found that he had a deletion of 20 genes from chromosome 15. Super rare. He was patient number 2 at Texas Children's Hospital in a study that they had been doing with congenital diaphragmatic hernia. And they've only now, I think it's like 20 people worldwide that they found that had this specific anomaly. And at the time, he was on maximum life support. My marriage at the time was already under significant stress. And some things kind of were revealed at that time when he was in the NICU. And I had put in my resignation as a school counselor because I was like, when he comes home, there's no way I can go back to work. There's like, he was going to have an NG tube when he came, like a nasal gastric tube when he came home. And so I had put in my resignation. And then within probably a 3-month period, I was divorced and I had a special needs child back in my house and no job. And so it was survival all over again. So I did everything I could to keep stability, only to find myself like in a very unstable kind of situation. But what I was going to say, ironically, is we found out, that there were going to be major issues when I was 3 months pregnant. And I started just writing, mass emails to all my friends. I would be like, I'm going to tell everyone every single week what's going on with him. He measures this much. This is what they're telling me. Pray for him. Pray. Like I was like, just kept putting, and that's how my writing came out. That's how my writing came out at that time. And so it's always been there. And I realized that writing, it has so much power because I feel like for me, and I think we're all different, I am better when I can slow down and I can think about everything and put it in a way that it's, you know what I'm saying? That it feels accurate to what's happening in my inner world. When something is happening in real time and I'm talking, I tend to ramble and go off on tangents and sometimes don't get the point across that I want to get across. So writing to me, it holds so much power. And I also think it's something that when you put it out there, people forget words when you say them. But when it's on paper, it's more tangible. It's like, this is real. And I think that me not having a voice as a kid, it feels like writing gives me that kind of power that I felt like I didn't have as a kid. So going back to your question about the path was there, but there are so many obstacles that kept coming up. And there was also that sense of kind of complacency because it was there was too much happening anyways. And then like when he was fast forward, when he was about 3 years old, my special needs child, this was 2012, we had some neighbors move in across the street. And my mom, she was visiting that weekend. And my son, he was out on his little bike outside. And she had a little boy and she was outside. And my mom, who's very introverted, is talking to the neighbor. And she's like, Allie, come meet your neighbor. Guess what? She's a therapist like you. She's an LPC like you, or she wants to be an LPC. She's a teacher right now. And I was like, oh, really? So I went over and we're talking and everything. And she's like, yeah, I'm a teacher and I'm, working on getting my, LPC right now. And she's kind of telling me about her process. And I was like, I've thought about that too, but I can't leave my kids and go to a class. And she goes, oh, well, I do it all online through Prairie View A&M. It's really easy. You can. And so I was like, okay, and I just it was in the back of my mind, but I left it alone. And then about a year later, every once in a while I'll start thinking about it again, because I was not, the system that I was in, there were a lot of things that felt very confining for multiple reasons. And so I was starting to feel like I can't keep doing this forever. And anyways, I had to sign off on the secretary, the school secretary had come. She said, I want you to check the number of years you've been working. So, because that's going to be equivalent to the salary you make every year. Well, I had noticed I'd been signing off every year on something that wasn't accurate. It said I worked a certain number of years that wasn't true. And I said, hey, this has been missing 3 years. And I said, can they retroactively pay back for the past 3 years? They haven't been. And she goes, they probably can't. Moving forward, they can, make it to what it's supposed to be, but not, they probably won't retroactivate it. And so in my head, I had this internal kind of conversation with God or the universe or whatever. And I was like, okay, well, if I get the money back for that, I'll put it towards those classes. And she told me it was highly unlikely that I was, and then she called me a few minutes later and she was like, they said that they'll give you the money back. And I was like, okay, fine. I'm going to go ahead and, so I just took, so I almost felt like it was, the path was there, even though there were all these obstacles. So I think the answer is it's both. The path was there and things kept pushing me back. So I just would take one class every semester because that's all I had this mental energy for. And I fortunately was able to use my hours as a school counselor. All I had to do was find a consultant, someone who I could consult with, who would supervise me, and who I would meet with weekly to talk about, the kids I was seeing. That's all I had to do. And I just went to my neighbor and asked who her consultant was. And she gave me the name. So it kind of came to me, even though I also pursued too, it was both. And then I want to say when I got closer to being finished with everything, 2018, I started getting gun shy. And I was like, well, it's good. I think I'm going to stay here. I'm going to just stay.
And when you mean stay, what are you doing? Are you getting government support or other types of support? Because I know that financial insecurity is something that you noted, which is like a third rail that's, been an area that from childhood has haunted. So I'm just curious, how are you able to, it sounds like you're taking a class or two and making a lot of progress, but spending the majority of your time home with the family. So I'm just curious, from the financial part, how are you able to keep that balance?
Oh, no, I was working. So I'm sorry. I stayed home this first year. And that year provided me enough time to find a Medicaid waiver program. And a Medicaid waiver program is for kids specifically. It's not based on income. It's based on the child's disability. That's it. And even though there have been all these barriers, there's also been little, just these little, whatever, God winks, whatever you want to call them. So there would be barriers in these God winks too, because I didn't know what I was going to do, how I was going to go back to work. And I ended up finding this waiver program, and he qualified. I want to say it was in March of 2010. So he was about, how old would that be? He was 7 months old at the time. They called me and said he qualifies for 19 hours of nursing care. And ironically, I had just started applying for positions for the next school year, to go back to school counseling. And when I was applying, it was for the next school year. But the same week that I got the 19 hours, I had a school in Deer Park call me and say, hey, we had a teacher or a school counselor who had to leave. We just need someone part-time. Would you be able to come in to finish up the year? And I was like, well, how many hours? They were like, well, you can pick. And I said, well, could it be 18 hours? Could it be? Yes. And so I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know by when May came what I was going to do because he only had 18 hours. We had this amazing. So the person who ended up doing his assessment, like the company, the nursing company that came to work with him, the lady, her name was Lori. She was the nurse, the head nurse or whatever, came out and did the intake. And I fell in love with her. And her birthday happened to be the same day as his. It was August 19th. And she fell in love with him. And I said, can you be his nurse? Even though she was the head person. Well, she ended up being his nurse. And when those 18 hours, when I would go to work, she actually helped. She filled out the paperwork for him to get 50 hours. So by June, when I was working at that one position, it was just part-time, they happened to know someone who needed a full-time position somewhere else. And I applied, and I want to say within the same time frame, that's when Caleb qualified for the 50 hours. So it worked out perfectly. So I was able to go back to work full-time in 2010, fall of 2010. So I worked for 8, you might hear him back. He runs around kind of making noise. That was my 15-year-old, the one I'm talking about right now. But anyways, I ended up going back to work full time and stayed at that same position for about 8 years. So from 2010 to 2018. And in that time frame is when I took the 4 classes and kind of finished all that stuff up. So
yeah. So then I think this is where it gets really juicy for the audience here is so now you've got 8 years and you have a track record. You have that stability that you crave. You've got good balance with someone, a caregiver that's extraordinary. Then you decide to end up jumping and starting your own practice. So share with the audience what some of the tension points were that were going through your head, because I think, we discussed there's financial considerations, there's imposter syndrome. Like what were some of the bigger, maybe boulders or rocks that you had to reconcile before you were willing to say, Allison, let's go. It's time and I'm ready?
The biggest one was the financial, like hands down, because I was a single mom. I had 2 kids, one with special needs. Like it almost didn't seem responsible. It was more about this responsibility because I didn't want to ever put them in a position that I was in with my mom. And, the insurance makes a big difference. Like that was the other thing, was the insurance. And then the second thing for me was, it was really just, I don't know what I don't know. I know that sounds like an odd thing to say, but it was like, I don't even know what I don't know what if there's things that I run into and I'm not prepared for them in private practice, even the business side, the getting on insurance panels, all of it, I didn't have any business experience at all. And so, I slowly just started asking questions, networking with other school counselors who were already like leaning into private practice. And those people ended up kind of being guideposts in a way to kind of help me feel a little bit more encouragement. But then the other thing was it was pain, honestly. And I going back to that whole concept of pain being part of the human condition, pain, we look at it as a bad thing, but it's a good thing. It's a good thing, I personally believe, because that's what causes us to grow. And I think that it was becoming so uncomfortable there where I was at, because the value system that I had just wasn't in alignment with the principle that worked there at the time. And for lack of better words, I want to say it was like February. I caught her in a lie, like it was. And for me, that was the final straw. And I said, I can't work with someone that I can't trust. And so I put in I was like, I just have to take the lead. But that last thing, I think for me, one of the things I've learned, and not to say I'm far from perfect, there's been many times where I feel like I've compromised my values for security in certain ways. But that for me was a stepping stone in saying, I'm not going to compromise my values. Like I'm not going to, like it's more important for me to be honest about things and work with people who are honest than stay in a place where that's not happening. And that probably was one of the, like, I guess a stepping stone in healing. Healing is being more true to my values versus true to my trauma.
And so that's, thank you for sharing, Allison, about, what ended up helping push you over the edge to make that jump. And so I'm curious for the listeners, like, what would you say once you did make that jump, what was the most satisfying or gratifying or brought you the most joy in the early days? And what was, maybe you talked about, you don't know what you don't know, like maybe one of the hardest unforeseen challenges that you had to overcome after you jumped?
Well, I think the fact that I had so much freedom, like I could make my own schedule. I could choose the kind of clients I wanted to work with. I didn't have to go ask someone for permission for something. I know it sounds weird, but I felt like I was finally an adult. It's like, oh, like this is what, I mean, it's very different when you work on your own versus when you work with someone. And sometimes I felt like, for lack of better words, I felt like I had to say, hey, can I go pee? And I mean, that's really extreme. But, there'd be times when I was working in that situation where it's like, my child is sick. I have to go. And I felt like I had to explain that. And for me, the freedom, and I think that it goes back to that freedom or security. And a lot of times you can't have both. You can have some degree of security, but you're never going to feel 100% secure when you go into, running a business or opening up a private practice or something like that. It's just, you can't. You have to, it's to some degree, it is trusting in yourself and your ability to figure it out and have the internal resources that you need to be able to figure it out. As far as the thing that I think was a little bit unexpected was I really thought I was going to work with kids. But it's very different to work with kids in the school system than to work with kids who are coming to you in private practice. One of the benefits of working in the school system is that you're protected by the school. And that sounds like an odd thing to say, but what I mean is I had to, when I was a school counselor, I did have to make CPS reports. I did have to, and, I didn't have to worry about someone making a complaint to the board and, me having to worry, do I protect this child? And I found myself in a situation, probably, I don't know, it was like a year or so in, where I was really stuck with, a major situation that was way more intense. And I didn't feel like I had the people that I used to be able to go to. And it's very different, and it's really sad because I think that there's a lot of people in private practice who maybe they start out with kids and then they stop because unfortunately, there isn't a lot of protection for the people that are trying to help those kids. And there's, for lack of better words, there's not a lot of protection for kids either. And so, what I kind of started to realize is kids that are in those situations, a lot of times it's not the kids, it's the parents. The parents need the help, not the kids. So I kind of started to shift and go, I want to work with the adults who have experienced this so that they're not repeating it. They're working through their stuff.
Yeah. So now your practice being real, what percentage of the clientele is adults? Is it 100% now?
100% now. I kind of realized that my judgment was going to be too impaired. I mean, as therapists, that's one of the things we have to look at, is your judgment going to be impaired when you're working with certain kinds of clients. And I think that's why it's important for therapists to kind of really figure out what their niche is and stay in that lane, and I loved being a school counselor and I would fiercely advocate for my kids. I felt my hands were very tied in private practice. I felt like they were very tied. And, that's why I kind of, had to make that change.
Yeah, that's surprising because usually you think in private anything, there's less red tape, less bureaucracy, and you could move fast and break things. And, government's slow and plodding. But in this case, there's some distinct benefits of having that umbrella and allowing you to better advocate for your client, which is a child.
Well, because when you kind of look at it, like if let's say I'm fiercely protecting a kid in the school system, they're going to sue the school district, not the individual. It's a very different situation. So I didn't feel like that was holding me back. If I thought that something was happening was wrong, I was going to intervene and do everything I could. And while I I have no regrets about how I handled the situation I found myself in private practice. I didn't want to do it again. It was mentally exhausting. And I was like, this is going to impact my mental health. And I had to kind of think about my own kids, and so unfortunately I had to make that hard position, because you become a target when you're just that lone wolf and you're trying to protect someone in a situation like that. Whereas when you're a part of an entity, that is the benefit, is you got the whole pack that's with you saying, we got your back, So that was kind of the one difference.
And while you were embarking on this new journey, were there really valuable references or resources, like from the Small Business Administration, from mentors, books, podcasts, maybe your neighbor, other folks that you really value and benefited from that you can share with the audience?
At the time, and I'm not on Facebook anymore, but I really utilized Facebook, like different Facebook groups. I was part of probably 20 different therapist Facebook groups, and I would find out all different kinds of like resources or trainings or workshops. Those were probably, I did do a little bit of networking and some like small business kind of avenues, but what I did mostly was get on insurance panels, and it was more word of mouth, and honestly building trust, like being very honest up front about the type. I think that honesty and staying in integrity with who you are is much more sustainable than trying to sell it, like be gimmicky and say, I'm going to sell you this thing. And then it's not long lasting. It's not sustainable. And so, one of the things that I do is I kind of realized, and all of these things, by the way, because I didn't know what I didn't know, I kind of made the mistake and said, oh, okay, I need to do this now. And so I made a lot of mistakes. And one of them was I wouldn't do like a consultation with clients before I met them. They could call and I maybe talk to them for a few minutes, and then I would see them. And I started to realize that's, because I can't help everyone. There's a certain group that I know I work really well with, and I've gotten really skilled with. There's a lot of things I'm not great at, but I'm really great at this one thing. And so really knowing yourself and knowing, what you can and can't do, and staying within your scope, whatever your scope is, and getting really good at it. And so that's been really important to me. So that going back to the consultations, I started having 15-minute, free consultations where, I ask these questions to make sure I'm going to be the right fit. And if I'm not, then I'm going to make a referral to someone who I think is going to be able to help them better. And being really honest about the process with me, like some of the philosophies that I've shared with you, like pain is part of the human condition. I'm not going to promise you that like this is going to be a 3-step process. And I've had I forget this sometimes. And it's surprising to me, but I've had some clients, especially younger clients, like in their 20s, where like I can tell when they're wanting to avoid pain, right? Like they'll say, well, how do I do that? And the minute they start asking how, there's nothing wrong with how, but when it comes to how do you do emotions, how do you really, that they're trying to avoid it instead of lean into it and move through it. And, when that starts happening, I've had conversations with someone like, you're not going to arrive. Like this is part of the human condition. When you're asking how, you're probably trying to avoid. So like, I do a lot of somatic work. So I'll say, so where are you feeling that now? Like where in your body are you feeling that wanting to avoid? Just notice that and just see where it goes next. And that's part of the brain spotting that I do. And so they learn to lean in, not run or avoid, but move towards it, so that fear is no longer the thing that's like controlling your life, that pain is not controlling your life. And so when we face fear, we face pain. That's when we have that kind of freedom, and when possibilities are limitless. And so kind of, going back to your, like the building it and the networking and stuff like that, it's really like bringing my most authentic self and being honest about what I can help with. Does that make sense? And that slowly built clientele over time.
Yeah. And it sounds like, for the audience, there was no silver bullet. There was just a lot of like hard work, one step after the other, to build trust and build that clientele. And of course, Allison wouldn't tell you there's a 3-step process, because there's none. And you got to get some pain, but that's where the growth and the reward is. And as you reflect, Allison, how has pursuing this dream reshaped your sense of yourself?
So, since it is kind of that two-part, like being able to kind of speak up and that, also helping others and being in private practice, that speaking up and speaking out, I did circle back to starting that book again back in November. I have done my own trauma work and started it pretty quickly after I got into private practice. And I was like, I really need to make sure that I'm keeping my side of the street clean so that I am, being the best version of me when I come to, help clients. And so, when I was going through my own trauma work, I did EMDR and I did brain spotting. And, it's very body based and it's very much about facing pain, moving into pain, like sitting with that pain and allowing it to move through you. Because I think that that's what builds that confidence. It builds confidence. That's where you gain the wisdom, the compassion for yourself, for other people, and really knowing who you are. But this is the backdoor gift of all of that is I have worked through a lot. I think that there's still always going to be little residual pieces, and I'll probably continue to be in therapy to some degree just for maintenance. But now I'm at a point where when I go to therapy, a lot of it has been like, as this past trauma has lifted, all the stuff that was on top, this creativity has come out. Like there's all this creative energy. And I want to say back in November, I just started writing and I couldn't stop. And it hasn't stopped. And, the other thing for me was because codependency, a lot of, I think that we have these gender roles in society, and I think that men can be codependent, women can be codependent. It shows up differently for each person, but there are societal things that reinforce it in different genders. So I think for women, we're told to be likable, to be palatable, to be agreeable, all of those things, because that makes us loving and forgiving. And so it reinforces it. And so what was happening for me when I was in doing that trauma work, I went in because I had this tightness in my jaw and in my chest. It just would not go away. And, when I started in EMDR, I was able to do a little bit, but kind of hit a wall because when it's complex trauma, it's more body-based. And EMDR, it is body-based, but not as much as brain spotting. When I started doing brain spotting, I want to say it was like, it wouldn't let up for 6 months to a year. It just was like an ice. It was like, and so what I was doing is I just kept on trying to focus on this and be softer, quieter, more agreeable. Don't rock the boat, let it go, keep your composure, all of that stuff. And then probably about a year ago, some things came to a head with my son in school with the educational system. And I ended up had to go back and do a modification. So I was dealing with the legal system and the educational system at the exact same time. But what had happened is that, and this is the thing that's the surprising thing with it, because we don't ever know what's going to happen with the trauma. Like there's a big degree of uncertainty around doing that trauma work and brain spotting. And for me, what I started to realize in sitting with myself and all that pain, the reason it wasn't relenting is because I wasn't doing the things I needed to do. Like I was trying to make myself smaller and smaller and smaller. And my body was like tight. It was like just pushing it all down. And finally, I kind of had a collapse in 2023. And I started having like panic attacks. It got really bad. And I had to, at that time, I started doing some different kind of trauma work, was like kind of going back and revisiting that 6-year-old part and really starting to radically love her and accept her. And when I did, I started to realize how much I had betrayed myself. And I started to see how I was my neurodivergent child. I was doing a lot of telling him to go along to get along. And I realized I can't keep doing that anymore. And I started speaking up more and more. I was speaking up in rooms I never would have spoken up in before. And the ironic thing is this started to loosen up. My body had all that wisdom the entire time. I just wasn't listening to it. And until I listened to it, this was going to feel that way. And so the writing, the words, all of that is ironically has been like that wisdom of my own kind of personal trauma work.
Yeah. And your memoir or your novel is still in progress, correct? And the working title is On Being Real, Healing the Codependent Heart of a Woman. Now, my curiosity is, are you writing this for yourself, like you said, to let go and put it out on paper? And if you didn't sell any copies, you would feel happy and complete? Or is this that plus you want to reach other people and help them, and you actually do want it to have ripples through other women's lives?
That plus. I had to really think about the purpose for a long time. And I have to keep grounding back into that as I write. And I have to put it down, and then I'll pick it up and I'll put it down. But a big reason was, yes, because I got to a point where it's like, I want, like, I think that so much of my childhood, I made myself invisible, and I made myself kind of an object for other people to be okay. That's what codependency is. I'm going to be what you need me to be. And that's just living in invisibility. And I think that I've gotten to a place in even my own trauma work where I remember having one specific session where I was getting upset, and I kind of started to realize I haven't let myself take up space. I get to take up space just like everyone. I don't get to take someone else's space, but I can take my own space. I have a right to be here just like everyone else, and I have a right to be seen. And seen is not the same thing to me as like attention. It's more of, I have a right for my lived and felt experience to be witnessed. Because I think as humans, we all want someone, some place where we can express and for our interiors to be witnessed by someone else. That's what therapy is. The thing that I like about, the writing, that's part of it. But the other part, as I've gone through my own, like I've been to different counselors, I've tried self-help books, all these different things. And I've gotten caught up into the 3 steps, the 7-minute, whatever it is. And for developmental trauma, that is not helpful. It's actually harmful, because especially if the person struggles with perfectionism and codependency, they're taking that literally. They're taking that like, I'm going to do the 3 steps and I will get to this place. So if I don't, then I really am broken. I really am defective, because a lot of times that's the belief they already have. So they're going into these like mental health systems that we have in place, believing that something is wrong with them if they went to a therapist or they read a book and it didn't work, versus realizing, first of all, you're not broken. You're human. You're human, and you're having a human response to your experience. And that's why it's so important to normalize pain, because it becomes suffering when we blame ourselves, when we think that it's some kind of moral character flaw because we're not feeling good and we've tried everything. And I think that part is really, really important before even starting any kind of process of therapy. Because a lot of times when we go into trying to heal, our intention is to run from pain. And if we do that, we're just going to kind of unintentionally recreate or invite more of it. Instead of saying, I'm doing this so I can be more whole, integrated, free, face my fears, work through trauma. It's very different than saying I'm doing it to get away from pain.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I think that when folks run away from pain, it's like the debt, right? That principle is going to be there, and it's just the interest is just going to compound and compound and compound. So when you eventually do decide to face it, it just becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and its tentacles have gone more into your identity and ego, so just harder to unravel.
And so the very beginning, I kind of ground into that purpose in my book and say, this is not a 7 steps, 3-minute, whatever book, and kind of go into what a lot of times we do in the mental health industry, and we commercialize mental health. It's like, no, you can't, like, these are human beings. We have these emotions that are messy. They're nonlinear. It doesn't go from point A to point B.
Yeah. So, Allison, now that you've endeavored to work on 2 of your lost causes, and we're talking about the memoir in the book, and then also the one that you've already turned into an unlost cause, which is the practice that you have, are you proud of yourself?
That's a good question. Here's the thing, like, one of the things that I have really learned about myself, I want to say it happened in 2023, that when I had that breakdown, And I kind of met these, what I call, I mean, not I, someone else coined the term shadow work, shadow parts. The shadow parts of us are the parts of us that we oftentimes like we have shame over. They're the younger parts of us that we've pushed away or we've exiled. And they're the most authentic expression of who we are a lot of times. So there was this part of me that I ran from my whole life that I felt was like, I didn't ever want to be seen as weak. I didn't want to be seen as stupid. Those two things. And a lot of that was because of childhood stuff. When I was really little, feeling like I was getting in trouble for things that I didn't understand why I was getting in trouble. I felt like I was stupid, and I also was small. So I felt like I was weak and powerless. So I ran from that my whole life. And because I ran from that my whole life, I think I always exuded this kind of mask of like strength. But people that are codependent, a lot of times they don't ask for what they need. They're like, I think a lot are admired, but they're not known. And that's very different. And so, I am equally as confident as I am insecure. And so I say all of that because I think all humans we can't have one without the other. Like we can't, in other words, because we're complex as human beings, I think that the thing that makes me confident and that makes me proud is the fact that I acknowledge my insecurities. Does that make sense? And that I acknowledge my humanness. Does that make sense? It may sound like a paradox, but that's what I'm proud of. I'm proud of that I love the parts of myself that I used to see as weak.
That is one of the most thoughtful responses to that question I've gotten. And definitely not hey, I'm going to evade it, but a thoughtfulness and a contextualness around that. And I even think that that's extremely deep, that I'll have to even think about that some more. But I appreciate you sharing that, because that I could tell that, there's been a lot of thought around that.
There's been a lot of thought around that. But I think that Brene Brown has said this. She says the truth is in the paradox. And I think as humans, we're paradoxical. We are paradoxical. We are strong and we're weak. We're soft and we're hard. We can be mean and we can be kind. And I think that integration, acknowledging all of those parts, it doesn't mean I think that we're more likely to let those, like the parts of us that are unhinged, the unhinged parts run rampant when we don't acknowledge them. When we acknowledge them and we love them, and we start to kind of bring them back to ourselves, we no longer disown them or project them onto other people. That's where we kind of find that freedom and that peace and confidence, if that makes sense. Because one of the things that I learned in 2023, when I started to kind of own that part that felt good, because when I was having the panic attacks, I felt very weak. I felt very fragile. I felt very helpless. And I kind of realized it was trauma like that hadn't really been processed. And I kind of turned to that younger part and would just talk to that younger part of myself and say, thank you so much for being here with me. I love that about you. And every time I could feel that anxiety or that fear or whatever, that's what I would do over and over and over again. And what I started to realize, I started owning these different parts of myself. And one of the things I started to realize is the more I owned the ugliest parts, the socially unacceptable parts of myself, no one can ever own me again because I own myself. So if someone calls me weak, I'm like, yep, I am. I don't care. Yes, there is a part of me that can be weak or whatever you want to call it. I call it sensitive. You know what I'm saying? I call it intuitive. But if someone calls it weak, that's fine. They're free to have that opinion. But that is their stuff. That's their projection that they haven't owned in themselves. That's the shadow part of them that they're projecting onto me. And I know that's not me. That's their stuff. But it's because I've owned those parts of myself. If that makes sense.
And Allison, if you think about, the bravery and the courage to turn these lost causes into unlost causes, if you were like on your deathbed and you did not take that step forward and you were ensconced in the security of the school district because, that was a driving motivation as a child, how do you think you'd feel?
I don't think I would feel like I lived. I don't think that I would feel like I fully lived. I think I would have felt like I lived for other people, not for what was true for me. I do believe that one of the things that I have this theory about with the clients that I see with myself, I see with my mom, I see it with my children. Sometimes I think that these things we pathologize, we call them disorder. I think they're actually untapped potential or gifts that got suppressed. So it could be, let me think of an example. Anxiety is like untrained empathy. Depression is, sometimes it is a existential longing for something more. And so like these things that we have, autism, like I think that I can't remember the name of it. There is a podcast right now. They're talking about these kids that have autism. It's the kind that don't talk, like mute. It's telepathy tapes. That's what it's called. And basically they found that these kids have telepathy. Yes. And so one of the things I've seen with my clients is that when whatever it is, their pathology, their disorder, whatever it is, when it is normalized and you can see the gold there's gold. All of a sudden the symptoms kind of ironically start to like subside, or they're not as bad, And so the reason I'm saying that is because sometimes the things that we're ignoring in ourselves, that's our purpose. And if we don't pay attention to it, it will become disordered. Does that make sense? It becomes something else. It turns into something else. So I think I'd probably have major anxiety and panic attacks still if I didn't start talking. Like I needed to get it out. It was just staying in my body, and it needed self-expression.
Yeah. And then Allison, what would you say to someone else who has like a simmering dream and then they've just been putting it off and kicking that can down the road, like, oh, maybe I don't deserve it, or maybe I'll do that, next year for my New Year's resolution, but it just keeps on, getting put off. What would you say to someone in that position?
Well, I definitely wouldn't shame them. I would say it's okay to be scared. It's okay to take baby steps. It's okay to pick it up and put it back down. Just keep picking it back up. Does that make sense? Like it doesn't have to, there doesn't have to be a timeline, but just don't not pick it up again. Does that make sense? And I think sometimes the other thing, and I know it's very cliche to say this, but how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time. How do you climb a mountain? It's one step at a time. It's this. So sometimes if we're like, oh, it's way up here. This was something I was thinking when I was 6 years old, and now I'm 50. And now at 50 years old, I have this memoir that's about 70-ish% finished, but it's still not finished, but I know I will finish it, and it took me until I was 42, 43 to go into private practice. And I had that dream starting when I was probably around 6, but it was more like it became a little bit more solidified when I was 18, where I was like, I think I wanted to be a child psychologist of some kind. But I went a very sideways backdoor route to becoming a therapist. And I kind of child psychologist. It's more like adults who have childhood trauma. So
yeah, no, I love that answer, which is one, I'm not going to shame them. Like everyone has their own kind of motivation, their own timeline. And then two, it's okay to be scared. You can pick it up, put it back down until, the time is right for you versus like just run and jump, right? So, everyone's got their own journey and their own background. And then what specific ask would you like to make of our Unlost Cause community?
I think that, if anything, like to support women, I think that there is, women run businesses. I know that there is a big lineage in my family of women who have like my mom, my mom's mom, my mom's mom's mom. I think these women were very gifted. And I think that because they did not have the resources, the tools, the access, a lot of that stuff it became disordered. I really believe that. I think I came from a lineage of women who were very intuitive and very, very sensitive. And I think that those things turned into mental health issues. And I think that when women aren't really supported, I think that that's why there's you see more like mental health kind of depression, anxiety, more along, a lot of times with women. So, if anything, that.
Got it. And then for the audience who, I would surmise that everyone's moved by your experience shares today, how can they support, follow, or connect with you, on your website, on your socials? Where are you the most active where they can follow and support you?
I think that if they just start with my website on-being, being-real.com, and then they can, I think that they'll see my Medium handle, my Instagram handle, my YouTube, and what else do I have? TikTok. I like TikTok. and my TikTok. Everything's pretty much there.
Wonderful. Well, Allison, thank you deeply for your vulnerability and wisdom today. Your journey from survival to thriving is profoundly inspiring, proving that our scars truly can transform into powerful gifts. Listeners, make sure to stay connected with Allison through her platforms at Being Real, and also subscribe to her socials and her TikTok because she really likes it. And don't forget to subscribe and share this podcast if you've liked it. Keep leaning into your unlost causes because you deserve a life filled with authenticity and purpose as well. Thank you. Before you go, if you're inspired and want to be a part of something bigger, subscribe, like, and share to help more people reclaim their dreams and live true to themselves. Also, let me know if you or someone you know would be an inspiring guest on this show. Together, let's spark courage to live without regrets. The Unlost Cause Way, one story and one person at a time.